Welcome to this mini lecture on curricula. It's a bit on the long side, so please hang in there with me. The goal this week is for you to gain an understanding of what curricula are and to have a framework for thinking about and analyzing them a bit more closely. So, what is a curriculum? The textbook authors, Kaplan and Owings, define a curriculum as all the learning that is planned and guided by the school, whether it is carried out in groups or individually, inside or outside the school. A curriculum is a plan for learning. We can further distinguish curricula from pedagogy, which is about instruction. I like to think about it this way: a curriculum is the what, and pedagogy is the how of teaching. By now, you have probably heard the terms educated and schooled used somewhat interchangeably. Let's take a moment to consider how we use these two terms and what they might mean. By educated, we usually mean learning that is ongoing. It can be in or out of a formal school program. Sometimes being educated points toward real world practical knowledge and experience. Someone we deem to be educated is usually someone who can do something with what they know. We might call them wise or even street smart. On the other hand, being schooled usually means having attended a formal program. For example, I can say, I was schooled at VCU on how to become a teacher. Being schooled does not necessarily mean I can do the work of a good teacher, but only that I got my degree or my credential there because I completed a specific program. Schooling is usually very defined, occurring in a specific place and time. I like to think of these two ideas as being on a continuum that reflects the underlying purpose for education: to produce a test score or data, outcomes, degrees, and credentials? Or is it to prepare students with practical skills for life beyond the classroom, or even to prepare them for employment? Let's keep this continuum in mind for a moment and consider some of the influences on curricula. As we know by now, there are many influences on public education, and curricula is no exception. The three big influences we've discussed in this course are the government, the economy, and religion. We might say curricula are never neutral, but always influenced by someone or some group that made a values based decision about what to include and what not to include. According to our textbook authors, curricular approaches have swung between two ends of a continuum, between subject centered and learner centered. If we think back to the history of education in this country, we might remember that in colonial times, the curriculum was probably pretty subject centered, and students were largely taught kind of classic subjects such as rhetoric, history, and math. What to include in a curriculum was really not part of the larger social debate like it is today. However, that began changing in the 19th century as public education was expected to respond to social factors such as industrialization, immigration, and the country's growing international profile. Core curricula were largely updated to include subjects such as language, math, science, and history. By the 20th century, curricula began to emphasize social and personal needs necessary for life beyond the classroom, including topics such as health, vocational prep, or even ethical character. By the mid 20th century, there was a pushback on these more progressive ideas to, and I quote, get back to basics. We might remember the influences of A Nation at Risk report, the No Child Left Behind Act, and the creation of the Common Core state standards. The standards were hailed as a contemporary approach that guided the development and assessment of schooling. The standards clearly communicated what students at each grade level were expected to know and do. But we also know that we're a nation of not one, but 50 or more different school systems. We know that schools are structured by and run at state and local levels. Some scholars argue that the shift to standards based instruction is a shift toward schooling and not necessarily education, that standards are subject centered and not student centered. Still, other scholars argue that standards are important and necessary to ensure that all children receive a rigorous and quality education. So, we're going to look at five notable scholars who have influenced American curricula. But first, let's keep this simple framework in mind and try to determine whether we think the five scholars' work is taking a subject centered or learner centered approach. And because we're digging in a bit deeper, let's think about the philosophy of education their work expresses. A subject centered curricular planning begins with content, which points more toward a traditional philosophy, whereas learner centered planning points more toward a progressive philosophy. Neither end of the continuum is good or bad. We are simply stepping back and using this framework as an analysis tool. For instance, we can have a learner centered curriculum that is more about schooling, teaching and measuring learning with testing that is decontextualized from practical applications. We could also have a subject centered curriculum that aims to educate students and to prepare them for practical outside of the classroom applications. Why do we even care about this? Let's think about teacher preparation for a moment. Do we expect a teacher prep curriculum to be subject or learner centered? I'm going to say probably subject centered because there are important things teachers need to know to do their jobs. They need to learn about curriculum, pedagogy, child development. They need to be experts in their content area. But do we want them to be schooled or educated? We want our teachers to have more than a degree or credential. We want them to be educated. We want them to be able to apply what they learned into their teaching practice in the classroom right away. So maybe we would expect it to be subject centered, educated curriculum. I'm going to put the big X in this quadrant for a teacher prep, a hypothetical teacher prep curriculum. Let's use this framework and analyze the work of the five scholars covered in our textbook. The first one is John Tyler's rationale. Tyler's rationale is described as one that implicitly considers the learner and recommends curriculum writers address these four questions in their design. What is the purpose of education? What kind of educational experiences does it offer the learner? How will these experiences be organized? And finally, how will learning be assessed? Tyler's rationale is very much including not only content, but the pedagogy or the how content will be delivered. This design focuses on learning experiences of students and how activities will not only construct meaning, but can be used to measure or assess outcomes. So let's see if our simple framework can help us make a little bit more sense of Tyler's rationale. I said that Tyler's rationale begins with how students will experience the content and how their experiences create learning. So I'm leaning toward a learner centered philosophy. Tyler was also focused on how learning will be assessed. So I'm leaning more towards the school end of the purpose. I'm going to place Tyler's rationale in this quadrant. Let's move on to another example. Number 2 is Hilda Taba's model. Hilda Taba was influenced by Tyler and also cognitive psychology. She developed a 7-step model that begins by first diagnosing need. She considers both the content and the learner and believes in teaching durable forms of knowledge or that which is concept driven. This is described as being contextualized or knowledge in use. Taba's model is described as taking a constructivist approach. Constructivism means learning through experiences, and that learning is done through active meaning making. Learning is active more so than passive. It's about putting knowledge to work. So let's get back to our framework and think about how we might analyze Taba's work. I said that Taba's model is described as constructivist, which is about putting knowledge into practice. So I'm leaning more towards the educated end of the purpose continuum. But Taba's model was also described as being both subject and learner focused. So it's more in the middle on the purpose continuum. So I'm going to put the big X for Taba's model here. Of course, if we had an actual curriculum to analyze, we might find our big red X moving towards one end or the other of these continua. We are only working at a high level here. Let's continue with another example. Number 3 is Bloom. Anyone who has taken an education course before has likely encountered Benjamin Bloom's 1956 taxonomy, which was later revised. Bloom's taxonomy, as it is known, develops increasingly complex levels of understanding and learning organized in a framework or taxonomy. Bloom and his colleagues were concerned with teaching for transfer, or how what is learned is used to answer questions or solve problems. This lovely, colorful pyramid, which I hope you will now and forevermore recognize, is something that is used as a method for classifying educational objectives, experiences, and processes. For example, this mini lecture is pretty low on the taxonomy. You are simply listening to and hopefully building an understanding. Understanding is down there on the second rung of the pyramid. But if you were asked to, say, evaluate a curriculum using information from the framework and from this lecture, you would need to recall, perhaps apply, and then analyze the curriculum. This is a little bit higher up on the pyramid. The higher up we go, the more cognitively demanding the task. And at each level on the pyramid, it includes those levels below it. So evaluating would include analyzing and applying and so forth. The taxonomy is still widely used today as a way to help teachers select appropriate content and design instructional activities to increase and strengthen students' cognitive skills. So let's think about Bloom's taxonomy and use our framework. I said Bloom's taxonomy is about the cognitive demand placed on the student. When I hear the word cognitive, I start to lean toward the schooling end of the continuum. But depending on what the task or question or problem was that the student was doing, we might be closer to the educated end of that continuum. And the taxonomy was focused on a task or what the student was doing, which makes me lean toward a learner-centered purpose or philosophy, excuse me. So I'm going to put Bloom's taxonomy in this quadrant. So let me repeat that. Between the learner-centered or subject-centered philosophy, I was leaning more towards a learner-centered approach because we're thinking about the cognitive demands on the learner. And I ended up in the schooled quadrant more so than the educated end because we're more fixated on the task. However, that might also change a little bit if we were using an actual curriculum. Let's evaluate another one. Number 4 is Wiggins and McTeague's backward design, which is based on the idea that curriculum is a blueprint for learning and that learning is derived from content and performance standards. Curriculum shapes content into a plan for effective teaching and learning and considers both the learner and desired outcomes. Rather than first deciding what to teach, then teaching it, and then assessing it, Wiggins and McTeague's backward design model begins with desired outcomes. This design works well when we incorporate standards because standards provide us with targeted outcomes. Backwards design, Backward design is very much about what students do, and the learning is in the doing. In this way, it is also considered as taking a constructivist approach. So let's use our framework on Wiggins and McTeague's backward design. I said backwards design begins with ideas, objectives, and outcomes. When I hear the word ideas, it makes me lean toward the subject centered end of the continuum. But their design is also described as constructivist, which leans more towards active experiences and the educated end of that continuum. So I would put backwards design in this quadrant, closer to the subject centered and slightly closer to the educated end of those continua. But again, this might be different if we were analyzing an actual backward design curriculum. Let's think of one more example. We're at number 5, Lisa Delpit's Other People's Children, and her work on culture and power differentials between teachers and students, and between dominant culture and students' cultures. Delpit believes that all children should be taught the codes and rules of the dominant culture in order to access its discourses of power in order to be successful. But this is done in a way that does not erase students' voices and cultures. Following this mini lecture, you will have the opportunity to view a short video on Lisa Delpit's work. I highly encourage you to spend a little bit more time learning about it there. So let's use our framework and begin with Lisa Delpit's work. When I hear the term power relations and culture, I instantly go to a critical philosophy, which we can't really determine as being subject or learner centered. It might not fit nicely into the purpose continuum here. Delpit is further concerned with minority children accessing dominant culture through content they need to know in order to do that. This makes me lean a little bit toward a subject-centered end of the continuum. Her aim is ultimately that minority students catch up with their white middle-class peers. Does this mean catch up in test scores and achievement, which makes me lean more towards the schooling end of the purpose continuum? So I'm going to put my X here. But this one is a little tricky, and we might do better if we had an actual curriculum to analyze. What's important is that we justify our answer with a little bit of evidence. So, our society continues to struggle and search for balance when it comes to curricula and what to teach children. We also struggle in our finding our purposes and our philosophy for education. Do we simply want to school our youth, or do we want them to become educated members of the society? I'm going to leave you here, as I often do with these mini lectures, kind of hanging, but I've equipped you with a simple framework and some initial knowledge that will hopefully allow you to access the discourse on public school curricula.